Serious, what's your story of seeing somebody's mental state degrade? My mother had cancer, and at the very end, maybe the last 2 weeks, there was a very rapid deterioration of her mental state. At first she'd say something a little off, like she had a couple of seizures, and I think she heard something about a Mediterranean cruise on TV, so she suddenly said, "I have the Mediterranean shakes. It goes like this," and she kinda moved her arms in a shimmy. After a few seconds she went, "Jesus, I'm losing my marbles," and we all, me, her, my sister, and my father, had kind of a sad laugh together. Little things like that went on for like a week. Then she started talking to people and commenting on things that weren't there. But she knew her mind was playing tricks on her. I remember my uncle, her brother, came up from Florida to say goodbye, and it took her a few minutes to realize she wasn't imagining. "Hi monsieur," she died a few of days later. Those were 2 very hard weeks for 15-year-old me, especially because on her 49th birthday just 5 weeks prior she seemed perfectly healthy. I of course knew she had cancer, but it seemed like she would pull through. Man, I haven't thought about that in a while. That was hard to write. The fact that she could acknowledge her mental state is deteriorating makes this even sadder. I'm sorry you all went through this. My cousin has schizophrenia. When I was a kid I remember him being completely normal. Then he joined the Navy and apparently got bullied a fuck ton. When he came back he was 100% different. He would just stare into nothingness. He didn't say anything. Sometimes he'd laugh, but he wouldn't smile while doing it, and it'd be so dry and robotic. Hey, he totally broke down. Does he have medicine? Yeah. As a follow-up, he was doing pretty good for a solid few years. I'd go hang out with him every now and again, and he actually seemed human. He had a real laugh, friends, steady job, etc. Then I guess about a year ago he started distancing himself. Nobody had heard from him, and they went to check on him at home, and his house was a wreck. Shit and piss everywhere. As of now I think he's starting to climb back up again. Very sweet guy, poor soul. I watched a friend get overtaken by his first bipolar episode in about 3 weeks. He started smoking a lot more weed than he had before. He was on Snapchat and social media non-stop. He started drinking heavily as well, and barely sleeping. He totaled his Jeep and got a Dewey. He went to his job and told his boss to fuck off, among other things. He was fired. He started getting angry very easily. During this time I spoke to his mom to let her know what was going on, but she was in denial still. The drinking and mania continued for another week. He went golfing with some friends, and as they were driving home, he lost it and started ripping his clothes off and tried to jump out of the car. They pulled over and he was screaming for someone to come and kill him. Monsieur, they calmed him down enough to get to the hospital, where he stayed for a few days. This all happened in 3 weeks. He's better now, which is really good to see. First episodes are so scary because it's so sudden. Luckily I was 13 at the time, but I broke so many laws and put myself in so much danger. I was buzzing the whole time. It took about a year to stop. Grandma, she had Alzheimer and dementia. She started losing her memory slowly over time. Then one day she fell and broke her hip. Being bedridden accelerated her illnesses, and within a couple of months she was just laying there and staring at the roof, barely speaking, and all she says is nonsense. She doesn't recognize anyone, not even her children. It's like she's not there anymore, and all that's left is her body. The sad part is that she's been like that for years. Dead but not really dead. That we can't even mourn her, probably because all the sadness and tears were shed while her body still lies on her bed. My mom has a brain tumor since I was barely able to make my own memories. It's so deep in the brain that it can't be removed. I witnessed firsthand the devastation of what failed surgeries can do. Although the tumor is benign, it presses her brain and it creates a liquid that affects other areas, causing epilepsy and other side effects. She's basically a toddler now that although she can sometimes remember me, she can't take care of herself at all. She degraded over years, but I don't have memories of a healthy and capable mother. My early memories involve visiting her in the hospital. This is perhaps the saddest one. Not only because you never got the chance to meet your real mom, but she also never got a chance to raise her child. My fiance's mom passed a few years ago from Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease. CJD for short. CJD is most commonly called mad cow disease, even though they aren't the same. CJD only happens to humans and mad cow is bovine. CJD is when these proteins in your brain called prions go crazy and start to fold and basically turns your brain into Swiss cheese. There is no cure and it is very rare. Only a few hundred cases a year. She was perfectly healthy except for being diabetic, but she had zero complications with her diabetes. Then out of nowhere she started having problems remembering things and then starting having mood swings. She went to the doctor but they couldn't figure out what it was. It wasn't until a month or so later that a specialist diagnosed her with CJD. She went from being completely healthy to not being able to move her arms, legs, control voluntary and involuntary functions, and then death in 8 months. It was extremely hard on my fiancé to see her mom lose everything that made her who she was. Her own mother and father had to see her deteriorate as well. I was just awful for the whole family. When we came back from my deployment, I literally watched my then-husband become a shell of the person he previously was. Prior to the deployment, he was so light, optimistic, and social. He slowly transitioned into a man afraid to leave home and eventually began to use substances and was finally released from duty because of it. We still remain friends after all these years, but he's still only a ghost of the person he was before. I am so sorry. This is awful to experience. At some point you have to accept that the person you loved is never mentally coming back. It's truly heart-wrenching. Not something I would want to describe in great detail, but got to witness what delayed onset PTSD can do to someone. I was aware that someone very important to me had gone through some shit in adolescence, but they seemed incredibly okay with it when we met and grew close. However, another related event occurred that revealed that their openness was a pretty thin crust over a fucking volcano of shit. This person went from happy-go-lucky, bubbly, generally quite charmingly extroverted and largely functioning, to an absolute emotional wreck in the space of a few weeks. If that, had to watch someone's psyche get gutted from the inside by something that happened nearly a decade ago, and had no idea how to even begin to help. The whole thing was incredibly grueling to witness, and I don't think I can even come close to imagining how it must have been to experience it. Over the course of the next 4 or 5 years though, I watched this same person basically rebuild themselves from the ground up, despite what seemed like constant relapses after even the tiniest progress. Can't overstate how much respect I have for them, and for the therapists that eventually helped them through it. Did they ever to get back to that person? I'm in a similar situation. In the middle of reconstructing. I fundamentally changed as a person but wonder how others experience it. I'm in the middle of the same thing right now. I see glimpses of my former self more and more every single day. Don't lose hope, my dude. Life is beautiful out there and it's worth every second of fighting for my own. I went from a happy 13 years old to being molested for 3 years, dropping out of school, becoming a drug addict, dealer for 20 years, married, then divorced. Wasn't till after that I got help, had some time in a hospital, got antidepressant medication then, and only then realized I had been depressed and going downhill since the age of 13. 7 years later, been drug-free for the whole 7 years. I am on off meds now and enjoy life. A close person to me told that he had what he thought was a mental breakdown at the age of 5 or so, and the reason was intrusive thoughts about death. specifically his own death. I said, why would you even be thinking that at that age? And why would he worry about that, because he was still a child and far from death? He just responded with, I don't know. It's like I know how it feels. It might have been just a one-time thing, but he had these mental breakdowns sometimes and it was not good. The most recent bad one was when he was 15. He was doing something happy or anything, but then he suddenly freezes up, then flinches and starts to cry like a child. And he cries for hours and kicks his feet. At this point I was scared because he was inconsolable and don't know what to do. After a night's sleep, he seems to be fine, but he seems to have momentary aftershocks, and would flinch and start to cry again. He said it takes 2 months to recover from this or be back to his normal happy self, but he becomes scared, frantic and sad in these 2 months. Worst thing is I think he kinda had PTSD from these episodes, and if something reminds him of these situation he breaks down again. One specific song was enough to make him have a mental breakdown, and it seems he is likely to have these in December or in the night. He's fine now and has ways to recover from the breakdowns, but it seems he is still prone to having these episodes. Has he seen a therapist or psychiatrist? Sounds similar to my husband, who was undiagnosed bipolar until he was 28 and had a manic episode with psychotic features triggered by being on Adderall. He also has PTSD and hears voices randomly. He handled it all surprisingly well on his own until it went too far. I was diagnosed as bipolar and prescribed Adderall really messed me up. I have PTSD too. In my personal opinion, of being a psychology major and dealing with tons of therapists and experts, I would say that Adderall can cause those symptoms in a lot of people. If the bipolar disorder was diagnosed after that episode, one would be skeptical. I've seen so many people diagnosed as bipolar who just weren't. Some awful thing will happen to them, and or they take drugs prescribed or street drugs, and the symptoms are exactly the same, totally indecipherable from bipolar disorder. I also think it's unusual but not unheard of to have that diagnosis so late. As someone who suffers from PTSD, it's awful, but it's still better in terms of recovery than having an innate biological mental problem. Monsieur, this means there is hope. I'm not an expert and I don't blame you if you don't trust me, but I wouldn't say any of this if I didn't think it would help or didn't know what I was talking about. I have the utmost respect for veterans and thank your husband for his service. Thank you so much for watching and have a good day.